All right, so number one of the three-way tie for number 6 is from Steve Darrow. Our friend Steve Darrow says, I tried to word this question differently in an earlier Stratosphere Lounge, but I got too wordy and you addressed another part of my question instead of the part I intended. So let me try again. Progressives take the fundamental need for proper regulation, building codes. Oh yes, this goes to the vapor boundary thing. I remember Steve now. Okay. Progressives take the fundamental need for proper regulation, building codes, environment, banks, and airlines, to name a few, and use that need as a means to further advance their agenda of creating an ever larger government. You've talked about asymptomatic actions and your idea of increasing awesomeness, but I am looking for the principle of when government involvement is justified and how to determine when it has gone too far. You and Merlin have been hanging out drinking some coffee, I guess. Let me see if I get this correctly. When I say increasing awesomeness, it's a reference to an analogy I've used before that I call King of the Hill. And basically it's like this. If you have a graph where the vertical line is human awesomeness and the, doing this backwards because I have to mirror it, yes. Okay, so here's human awesomeness and here is increasing activism, right? More and more social activism. And the way it looks to me is it's a bell curve. So here we've got misery, and then as we increase our activism, we get more and more and more awesomeness, which means happiness, freedom, and all the rest of it. But there comes a point when as we continue to increase our activism, we actually get less and less and less freedom. And that's when you are over the hill, literally over the hill. And that's when you have to go backwards. You have to conserve the top position. So my argument is that all freedom-loving people are liberals while people are being oppressed. But once people have stopped being oppressed, and now it becomes things like racial quotas and things like, hate speech and protected speech and all the rest. Now you've gone too far. You have to back up, get back up to the top of the hill because more activism is actually reducing human freedom and happiness and awesomeness. So what's the principle? Well, again, I haven't read these before. I know I keep saying that because I have to think on my feet here, but I would say, just chewing on it a bit, Steve, I'd go to the fundamental principle of what I believe in, which is everybody should be left alone unless they infringe upon another person. And the definition of infringing is those 3 laws, or 2, depending on how you want to do it. I like to say it's 3 things. You can do whatever you damn well want to so long as you don't hurt anybody, you don't take their stuff, and you do what you promise you're going to do. So any form of burglary is taking their stuff, any kind of an assault is hurting somebody, and any kind of contract violation is not doing what you promised to do. So then the question becomes, if we use that as a guideline, how much government do we get, and how much do we need? And I think you'd be quite shocked to realize how little government we would need in a case like that. So let's take a couple of examples. Just one of the ones you included, and one. There goes Superstar Carla. We'll see you tomorrow. Let's take airline regulations. Many people say that if you didn't have laws, if you didn't have regulations about airline maintenance, then the market would determine that the companies that cheat on maintenance go out of business. Probably true, but unfortunately, they would lose their reputation because a number of people died. I've been pretty close to. I studied quite somewhat in depth the Alaska Airlines accident that happened out here in the 90s. It was just off the point where I go flying all the time. And that accident interests me primarily as a pilot because it was a long process. It was, from the time they took off from Mexico, they were headed, I think, for San Francisco or Seattle, one of those places. And they found out the plane was getting harder to trim, and the more they tried to change the trim on the horizontal stabilizer, the worse the problem got. And then they stopped messing around with it. Then they, Anyway, the point is they had a problem, and the more they tried to fix the problem, the worse the problem became. And the problem was that just a jack screw that adjusts the trim on the horizontal stabilizer had been inadequately maintained and was not lubricated well enough, and it basically froze up. And when it got to the point where it froze up enough, I think the whole thing just detached and just came loose, or it trimmed the airplane into an unflyable position. And in any event, they started out at something like, 28,000 feet, somewhere in there, 30,000 feet, and had a problem, descended, and then the plane just was holding on for a while, and then they just lost it and rolled inverted and went into the water from a fairly decent altitude, and it was witnessed by a bunch of other pilots as well. And the air traffic control recordings of that are pretty terrible, and pilots doing everything he can, so is the co-pilot, as usual, fighting it all the way down. Now, that was a violation of federal regulations regarding maintenance procedures, and it was an intentional violation designed to save money and cut corners. I know this is strong language, but this is what I believe in. It was in 2000. Thank you, T-Dog. You could make a fairly compelling case that that Alaska Airlines murdered those people. There was a case being made. God, who was it? It might have been. What's her name? It might have been Commodore Vanderbilt, or maybe it was Mark Twain. Somebody was basically saying that if a ship sails, they were making this argument back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, maybe a little earlier, and basically this person said, look, if I have a shipping company and I know the ship is a fire trap, and I know it's leaky, and I know the rigging isn't good, and I know all of these things about it, and I know the captain's a drunkard and all the rest, and I put people on that ship knowing these things, and then something happens, I'm responsible. I've committed some kind of murder there because I knew better and I allowed it to go on anyway. And what that Alaska Airlines incident tells me is certainly somebody knew better. Somebody said, no, we're not going to do that. There's a book on procedures on how they're supposed to go. And somebody said on the shop floor, somebody said, no, we're not going to do that. We don't have time. Now that is not a decision made by a mechanic or a top-level A&P. That's a decision put on the guy in charge of the repair facility by management upstairs, who are saying we're bleeding money, and if you want to keep your job, we're going to have to find a way to cut corners, and so on and so forth. However, this is a perfect example to me of a regulation that needs to be there. And the argument that, well, now that we knew that Alaska cheats on their maintenance, the market's going to basically put them out of business. Small consolation to the people on board that aircraft. And the people boarded that aircraft with, I think, a reasonable supposition of safety. I think that's a pretty good expression. I had a pilot tell me once there are two different kinds of aviation accidents, and it basically works like this. Pilot gets killed and goes to stand in front of St. Peter. And the two different kind of accidents are when St. Peter says, hey, tough break, kid. And the other one is where St. Peter says, what the hell were you thinking? Tough break, kid, is something that it's out of your control. Something happens and nothing you can do about it. What were you think is when you flying drunk, or you fly into weather that you know is bad, or you're trying to run under clouds, that kind of thing. Passengers you can't expect to be protected from tough break, kid accidents, and that's why it's defined as an act of God kind of thing. But you do have, I think, a right to be. If we don't trust people enough to provide what I would call ambient level of safety, then that person is their fist is hitting my nose, right? In other words, an ambient level of safety is kind of like what we talked about a couple episodes with the ambient level of risk. Somebody mentioned in the comment section, should the fact that you can own firearms mean that you could own a tank? Probably. Does it mean you could own a nuclear weapon? And the answer, I think, is no, because the ambient risk is so high, and furthermore, it's hard for me to imagine defending yourself with a nuclear weapon. I mean, that would be a fairly dramatic statement of individual crankiness. So there's also, I think, an ambient level of trust that a society needs in order for it to work, and we have to have a fundamental level of trust. Now, when you have this level of trust, then you start getting into all of the lawsuits. Was this trust violated? Was it an accident? Did they know? The lawsuits are awarded, and then the insurance companies pay out, and so then the companies decide it's easier to settle. The insurance premiums go up, the amount of lawsuits goes up, and you're stuck with this mess that we have now. So the question is, nobody disagrees about the airline maintenance regulations. The question is, what do we do about all the other ones? And my answer is, we repeal them all. We certainly repeal any regulation that does not involve physical harm to somebody else. So if you are putting chemicals into the river, I'm sorry, it may be your factory, but it's not your river. And the people downstream from you have not agreed to this activity. But when you get into the kind of silly let me take an absolutely really ridiculous example, which is apparently true. Up in, it's either Oregon or Washington State, I think it was Washington. Somebody was telling me now that the state is actually flying drones over people's property, and what they're doing is they're comparing photographs, before and after photographs, to make sure that nobody cuts down any trees on their property, because if you cut down a tree on your own property, you cut down a tree on, you own 100 acres and there's a tree right in the middle of it. In Washington, if you cut that tree down without a permit, you are subject to a substantial fine. And one of the cases that got a lot of attention was that a guy deep on his own property, owned a lot of property, decided to put in a pond, dug out this big hole, lined it with plastic, put water in there, reeds, became a wildlife sanctuary, ducks were there, all of this stuff. Everything was working great. It was beautiful. It was nice. Nobody complaining. He's not putting mercury in there. He's just putting water in there. And he provided this incredible habitat because he liked the look of it. And it's his property and his money. Well, they found out that he did it. And the state made him fill it in, fined him, and then told him if he wanted a pond, he had to apply for the license, which was hundreds or thousands of dollars, in which case he could then do exactly what he had just done on his own property using his own money. And the people that wrote those laws need to be burned at the stake. And so do the people that enforce those laws. Those people need to be burned at the stake publicly during prime time, although prime time, kids, is a time that meant that everybody was watching TV at the same time. It's getting a little old. Because that's a perfect example of the kind of thing that is not in the public interest, in fact, is a gross violation of that person's freedom. And furthermore, one of the things that you understand, and Natasha's helped me understand this quite a lot too, and that is this. So many of these regulations are not designed in the public interest. Many, many of these regulations, when you get right down to it, are revenue streams for the state or the federal government. If these swine can make it so that every single person in America is violating some law or another, some regulation rather, not a criminal law, if it turns out that that's the case, then just think of all the money that the government can make from fining people. And I think all of this kudzu needs to be cleared out. In order to have that regulation put in place, you would have to make a pretty clear, compelling argument, same kind of argument with any other crime. You'd have to make the argument that this company is risking or harming people beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you can't prove that harm, and the burden would be on the state in this case, then the regulation goes away. So if a guy's putting a tree in his backyard or cutting a down tree, it's his own damn business, it's his own yard, it's his own tree. And same thing if he wants to put in a pond. If he wants to put in a pond, rock on. If he puts mercury in there and it contaminates the water table, then that's a different story, right? Pretty simple, really. The whole situation is really just out of control, and the boundary line gets dimmer and dimmer. But every time I have a question I don't know how to answer, I go back to the 3 laws, and it usually sets me straight. So I would say that, yeah, pretty much eliminate all of them. Theoretically, eliminate them. You kind of, it's like making a chess move. You keep your finger on the piece. You basically say, as far as we're concerned, they're virtually all going to be eliminated. However, during this process, we're going to see which ones we think are essential and which can be made a case for, airline regulation and maintenance being one of them. And then the rest of it goes away. That'd be nice if that were to happen, I think. Okay, so